right, good evening, and thank you all for joining us again in Apologetics. Want to give a couple brief announcements. After this week, we have 2 weeks remaining in this class, and then we'll go back to our normal schedule, but just 2 weeks remaining, and I've enjoyed doing this, being a part of it, and looking forward to tonight and the following 2 weeks as well. In the front lobby, there's a table. If you've not already seen it, or if you came in one of the other doors, there are snacks back there that Miss Debbie brought. And I've said this a few times, but I'm sure you've noticed, she has brought snacks most of the weeks we've had this. And if you've gotten any of that and not had a chance to thank her, please do so. She's taken a lot of time. Yeah, give her a hand. Yeah, she's taken a lot of time each week to make those and bring them, and we do really appreciate that. So if you can, stop by, grab some of those. Also, there are papers and pens as well if you did not get the paper for tonight. Last week, I was out of town, and Mr. Sandrige taught the resurrection for us and did part 1. And tonight, he will be resuming and doing part 2 to have one full lesson of it. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to pray, and then he's going to jump right in. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all you've done for us. Thank you for the opportunity for us to all be here together and to assemble and to learn together and grow together as your church. We ask you to please be with us as we listen to this lesson. Help us to grow in our own confidence and certainty of the faith that we have, and also be better communicators of the truth and point more people to you and to the truth of your word. We thank you for the resurrection and everything that it means to us, knowing that our salvation is sure. We love you. Help us have a great evening. In your name we pray. Amen.
Is this on? All right. I'm going to slide that over. He called me Mr. Sandrige. You know, I taught him when he was in school. I guess he can't shake that. Now we're on staff together, but he still calls me Mr. Sandrige. Makes me feel old. I don't know. Anyways, easy. I don't know who said that. I've mentioned this both times I've been up here. The Wednesday night I preached, and then last Sunday night. I get really nervous doing this, but I did text Cam last Sunday night. I said, he asked me how everything went. I said, I think it went well, and honestly, I'm excited to finish it up next week. Now that it's next week, I'm back to being nervous again, but we're here. I almost chickened out and had him just cover my material. But I'm excited to finish. This week we'll actually get into the resurrection. Let's start off with a little review. You'll see on the handout, if you grabbed it, there's a little bit of review here. We're not going to go back over everything, obviously, because we want to use the time that we have wisely. But by way of introduction, last week, we made 2 key points, and I just want to reemphasize those as we get back into tonight's lesson. That first of all, the resurrection of Jesus is an objective claim. This cannot be something that is true for one person and not for another, okay? Just as we used the illustration last week, this podium is either here or it isn't. That is an objective fact, okay? With Jesus, he either resurrected or he didn't. The tomb is either empty or it is not. There is no in-between. There's no middle ground. So we laid out the fact that it is an objective claim. And then our second introductory point is the fact that Christianity is worthless unless the resurrection is objectively true. So we know it is an objective fact that it either happened or it didn't. If it didn't, then Christianity is worthless. So what we started to get into last week is to lay the groundwork before the resurrection, the fact that Jesus did in fact die. And we went through all of the evidence surrounding that, all that he went through. We watched that video from a trauma surgeon, just how much his body would have endured as a human being. There's no possible way he could have survived. And so we laid the groundwork there that he did in fact die. And then we looked at his burial and really just more or less addressed the skeptical argument that the tomb of Jesus was an unknown tomb. And hopefully I was able to lay out clearly enough last week that that is in fact not the case. The tomb was a very well-known tomb based on who it belonged to, the fact that there were those that, like the Jewish leaders that so wanted him dead that once he died, they would not have ignored where his tomb was. They even asked for a Roman guard to be placed outside of the tomb, so that added to who knew where that tomb was. So we laid all of that out last week. So we didn't even get into the resurrection. This week, what we're going to do is we're going to address the resurrection of Jesus. You see Roman numeral 3 on your handout there is the resurrection of Jesus. what we're going to do, and there's no way, even in the 2 45-minute time frames or time periods that we've had, to really get into everything. It's quite an exhaustive amount of information that you could cover. We're going to basically look at 4 key lines of evidence, four major things that will help us to, again, come to the reasonable, logical conclusion that Jesus did physically resurrect from the dead. So our first line of evidence that we're going to look at, letter A, is the empty tomb. While this is a very simplistic point, it is a vitally important point. Because if the tomb was not empty, then we would not have a claim of a resurrection, right? So it's very simplistic, a very basic point, but it is a vitally important part of all of this, and that's why we're going to start with this, this first line of evidence being the empty tomb. A few things to help substantiate this is, number one, this is unanimously recorded in all 4 Gospels. Unanimously, okay? We've already laid out the reliability of Scripture, those that wrote the Scripture, those that gave their eyewitness accounts and testimonies through the Gospels and through the other books of the Bible. This fact that the tomb was empty is unanimously recorded in all 4 Gospels. And on top of that, the stories of the resurrection are very basic stories that lack fictional embellishments. If it were me making up a story, right, about this guy coming back from the dead, it would not have been as simple as they put it. There are no grand stories in Scripture of how Jesus rose from the dead. They're very basic, simple stories. Me, I would have been like, man, he rose from the dead and ripped the grave clothes off. We see that they were folded neatly and left there in the grave, right? I'd be like, he ripped them off, and then he kicked the door down, and the door, or the stone, and it fell on the Roman soldiers and took care of them. And when he came out, he was just this blazing light of glory, and he walked around parading himself saying, see, I told you I'd come back. But that's not what happened. We don't have all of this fictional embellishment in any of these stories. I'm hitting on the comic book superhero stuff here, aren't I? All right. That's not what happened. That's not what these accounts are. They're very simple stories of the resurrection that lack these fictional embellishments that would have been added if the story was not true or if they were making it all up. Also, and we're going to keep hitting this point, but all 4 Gospels record that women witnessed the empty tomb. And we've laid it out a few times. I'm not trying to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but when they include these embarrassing details, when you have these male authors of these books that can honestly say that the women beat us to the tomb. They were the ones who went and witnessed that this happened. If they were embellishing, if they were making up this story, those would not have been details that they would have included. They would have been the first to point out, I was there first, right? They would want to take the credit for that. So the fact that they admit that the women were the first to the tomb, this adds credibility. It's not a detail that they would have made up. Kind of a side note here, and we're going to come back and touch on this at the very end, but even the allegation that the disciples stole the body of Jesus presupposes that the tomb was empty, right? So as we're laying out the fact that the tomb was empty and seeing that the Gospels record it, they record it unanimously, they don't embellish details, they in fact include embarrassing details, and even skeptical arguments that say that, the disciples stole the body from the tomb presupposes that the tomb was in fact empty. Also, and this will be the last point under the empty tomb, the early Christian church began preaching the resurrection about 7 weeks after Jesus' death. You read in Acts chapter 2, the story of preaching at Pentecost. Pentecost means the 50th day, right? There's 7 days in a week. So at 7 weeks, that'd be 49 days. So around the 50th day is when the disciples began to stand up and boldly proclaim the resurrection. This is a very short time frame, right? We're not talking about 7 years or way down the road that they finally muster up enough courage to begin preaching this now that it is far enough out of everyone's minds that they can't remember. They began to preach very shortly after it happened. So this preaching would have been heard by people who were familiar with Jesus, with his life, with his death, with the things that he said. If the disciples preached a resurrection of someone who was still in the tomb, the preaching could have easily and quickly come to a stop if a critic would have gone to the tomb where he was laid and either, like we talked about last week, exhumed the body and paraded it around and said the tomb was not empty because here's the body, or could have just simply took people to the tomb, showed them here's the stone, go ahead, roll it away. There's the body that's in there. There's no account in history that this ever took place. So we have a definitive, clear, logical explanation that the tomb was, in fact, empty. Let me read you this quote by a man named Paul Meyer. He's an American who is an ancient historian. He said, "If all the evidence is weighed carefully and fairly, it is indeed justifiable, according to the canons of historical research, to conclude that the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, in which Jesus was buried, was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter, and no shred of evidence has yet been discovered in literary sources, epigraphy, or archaeology that would disprove this statement." We've got nothing that says to the otherwise that the tomb was not, in fact, empty. So as we begin to lay out the evidence that Jesus did resurrect, we start with the simple but vitally important fact that the tomb was empty. Our second line of evidence, letter B there, are eyewitness accounts, eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus. The New Testament, you see this as number 1 under letter B. The New Testament records that there were 12 appearances of the resurrected Jesus over a period of 40 days. 12 appearances over a period of 40 days. Okay, first of all, that's a lot of appearances. That's a lot of eyewitnesses to the fact that Jesus did resurrect. That in and of itself is a staggering number over a 40-day period of time. We're not going to take the time to go through all of them, but I did ask if Scott could get this set of verses up on the screen, because this set of verses in 1 Corinthians 15 actually lays out about half of them, half of the various appearances that Jesus made after his resurrection. So we're going to read through these and talk through a couple of them. I'll hit on a couple more, and then we're going to look at a skeptical argument that has been posed against this idea of these eyewitness accounts. But 1 Corinthians 15:3 said, and this is Paul obviously writing to the Corinthians, the church at Corinth, "For I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried," so we made those 2 points last week, "and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures. And," so it's a continuation of the thought, "and that he was seen." So Paul's laying out, and we're going to find later on in our lesson tonight, this isn't actually Paul's original words. We'll see that later on tonight, and that'll make more sense in a minute. But we're going to see that what Paul is laying out here, what he's telling to the Corinthians, says that the gospel is the death, burial, resurrection, and these eyewitness accounts. Okay, these post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And that he was seen of Cephas. Cephas here means, the word means stone. This is another name for Peter. So we see that Jesus appeared to Peter. Then of the 12, so now we have two of the 12 appearances. Verse 6, after that, this is a big one, and we'll talk about why here in a minute. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once. 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. So he's saying there was a time that Jesus showed himself to over 500 people at one time. And what Paul is saying is, as of the time of this writing, most of them are still alive. So go ask them yourself. Only a few of them have fallen asleep, have passed away. Okay? So out of that 500, most of them are still remaining unto this present. Verse 7, and after that, he was seen of James. This is Jesus' half-brother. Okay, he was seen of James. Then of all the apostles, and last of all, he was seen of me also, as one born out of due time. So we see like 7 of the 12 appearances that Jesus made are recorded right here in this set of verses, all right? On top of that, we see in John chapter 20, and we're not going to pull these up and read these, but John 20, verses 10 through 18, he appeared to Mary In Matthew 28, 1 through 10, he appeared to Mary and some other women. And in Luke 24:13 through 35 is when Jesus appears to and walks and talks with the disciples on the road to Emmaus. So you got all these varying appearances of Jesus that he makes over the 40-day span of time. That is a lot of people that saw and claimed to see the resurrected Jesus, and that's hard to, you think of like going to court and having a trial. If you've got 12 eyewitness testimonies that all say the same thing, it's going to be hard for a court of law to overturn something or to prove something to the otherwise. Does that make sense? So you've got these eyewitness testimonies. Let's address a skeptical argument. Here called the hallucination theory. This is actually kind of laughable, but it is a theory, so we're going to talk through it. The hallucination theory. This argument claims that all of these encounters were psychological illusions or hallucinations triggered by intense grief. Psychological illusions or hallucinations triggered by intense grief. And we're going to talk through several objections as to why this hallucination theory just can't carry water. The first of which, letter A, hallucinations, according to science, are individual phenomena. Hallucinations are experienced by one person. All of us in this room would not have the same hallucination at the same time of the exact same things. Even if we all had a hallucination at the same time, which would be insane, it wouldn't all be the same thing. We would all see something different. If we were all wandering around in the Sahara Desert for 40 days and hadn't had water, and we start to envision water, we're not going to all see it. You're going to be like, there's one over there. I'm going to be like, no, it's not. It's over there, right? We're going to see different things according to science, right? These are individual phenomena. Diverse groups of people do not, and the blank here is share, hallucinations across multiple locations and multiple time frames. It's just not anything that has been observed in science. I'm going to read you a quote to kind of summarize this hallucination theory and all the objections. I'm going to read you a quote that puts it all together. It's just not something that is ever experienced. The sharing of hallucinations by multiple groups of people at various times in different locations. It's just not something that takes place. Jesus appeared to groups of people on multiple occasions, including over 500 at one time. You mean all 500 plus people that were there that one time hallucinated that they saw him? That is just mind-blowing that this could even be a theory, right? Much less that 2 people saw him this time, and 1 person saw him this time, and 3 people saw him this time, and 12 people saw him this time, and 500 people saw him this time, and they all hallucinated it. But the 500 that were there at one time all had the same hallucination. Do I need to go any further, right? Let's see, letter B. Jesus appeared to skeptics. So if all of these disciples shared a hallucination because they were all grieving, right? That was our hallucination theory there, that these were hallucinations or psychological illusions because of intense grief. How do you explain the 2 times that Jesus showed up to skeptics? Were they grieving? Right? Here are the two skeptics. I guess it carries over to the back of the page there. James, the half-brother of Jesus that we talked about. James didn't even believe in Jesus. I gave you the reference there of John 7. If you read verses 3 through 5, it gives you better context. But I just put the verse 5 there because it says, and his brethren did not believe on him. James, Jesus' half-brother, didn't even believe in Jesus. So when Jesus appears to James, what's the explanation there under the hallucination theory? Because he would not have been grieving, not in the sense of a disciple or a follower, right? If you read those verses from John 7, his brethren actually being kind of sarcastic towards him. If you can really do all of these great wonders, why don't you go show yourself? Why don't you go get yourself a big following? They're kind of being sarcastic and making fun of them. And then that's when the Bible says, because his brethren didn't even believe on him. So the hallucination theory kind of falls short here because this is not a guy who would have been grieving. This is not a guy who believed in him and believed that he would have resurrected. And of course, the other one being Saul, who later became Paul. This is a guy who wreaked havoc on the church, who was persecuting Christians. Again, would not have been grieving when Jesus appeared to him. And we'll see later on when he had a transformation or a change of heart. So the hallucination theory, just from the scientific standpoint that people don't share hallucinations, but also then how do you explain Jesus showing himself to skeptics and these skeptics having a change from not believing in him or persecuting the church to what they became later on. And then here it is, letter C, Jesus appeared to women. Again, not something that would have been put out there if this were something that were made up, or if this is something that the disciples or whoever were trying to create a fictitious story. Let me read you this quote. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think we've got time here. This is an excerpt from a book entitled On Guard, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision by William Lane Craig. There's your boy. Which I told them last week, we didn't have a apologist of the week last week or this week, so you might have to give us two. But William Lane Craig, I know Brother Cam likes him a lot. He says this, or this is the excerpt. The hallucination hypothesis obviously does nothing to explain the empty tomb and the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. But it arguably has weak explanatory power even when it comes to the appearances. Suppose that Peter was one of those individuals who experienced a vision of a deceased loved one or experienced a guilt-induced vision. Would this alone suffice to explain the resurrection appearances? Not really, for the diversity of the appearances bursts the bounds of anything found in the psychological case books. Here it is. Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times. Not at just one locale and circumstance, but at a variety of places and under a variety of circumstances. Not just to one individual, but to different persons. Not just to individuals, but to various groups. Not just to believers, but to unbelievers and even enemies. Positing a chain reaction among the disciples won't solve this problem because people like James and Paul don't stand in that chain. Those who would explain the resurrection appearances psychologically are compelled to construct a composite picture by cobbling together different unrelated cases of hallucinatory experiences, which serves only to underline the fact that there is nothing like the resurrection appearances in the psychological case books. So he's just, again, reiterating the point that this is not something we've ever witnessed to have taken place, that various people at various times share a hallucination. Again, kind of laughable that it's a theory, but it is. So we want to make sure that we hit that one. The tomb was empty. We looked at the eyewitness accounts here. Letter C, this is a big one in my opinion, the transformation of the disciples. The transformation of the disciples, which stems from the post-resurrection appearances that he makes to them before the resurrection, okay? Before they see Jesus after the resurrection. You've got a group of disciples who, first of all, the ones that went with Jesus could not stay awake and pray with him in the garden, okay? Then, and we see that, I think I recorded it for you, Matthew 26, 36 through 45. I gave you that reference. Then in Mark 14:50, we see that they fled when Jesus was arrested. When Judas betrays him and he comes with the ones to arrest Jesus, the disciples take off running and flee. It's a scared group. Luke 22:54 through 61 records that Peter denied knowing Jesus. That's a pretty big step from not just fleeing, but then when you're confronted on it, I don't even know who that guy. That is a big step in the opposite direction. Letter D, in John 19:25 through 27, we see that only John and some of the female followers were even present at the cross when Jesus was hanged. Again, where are the other ones? Where's the majority of the apostles? They've run, they've fled, they're scared for their lives at this point. And letter E, John 20:19 tells us that these guys were all hiding for fear of the Jews. So before they encountered the resurrected Jesus, they were scared. They were hiding. They didn't know what to do with themselves, right? Then after encountering the resurrected Jesus, letter A, we see that they boldly preached that Jesus was resurrected. That's a big change. From hiding, from fleeing, from not being present at his cross. This is the guy they followed for 3.5, I don't mean to call Jesus the guy. That sounds disrespectful, but they've been with him and followed him for 3.5 years, and when he's put to death, they're nowhere to be found. They're scared, right? And now all of a sudden they're standing up and they're boldly preaching in hostile territory, I might add, right? We just talked about this was only 7 weeks after Jesus was crucified. Those that wanted him dead it's not gonna sit well with them that they're now preaching that he's resurrected. Letter B, they were willing to suffer threatenings and persecutions. And I want to say, how cool is it that God worked out the timing of Brother Josh's message this morning, where he hit Acts chapter 5 and talked about some of the threatenings and persecutions that they underwent for teaching the resurrection. This is one of these moments here that they're willing to suffer. They're thrown in prison. When they're rescued from prison, do they go back into hiding? No. Where are they the very next moment? They're back out there preaching and teaching. So they've gone from being scared and hiding to boldly preaching, even in the face of persecution. Letter C, they never recanted in the face of persecution. Not only did they change and become these bold preachers, but at every time that they are persecuted, every time that they're threatened and thrown in jail and beaten, they never recant. Acts 5:41 through 42, and it was at the very end of what Brother Josh was preaching this morning, but it mentions that they did not cease to teach and preach Jesus, even in the face of all that they went through. Could you imagine, and again, how quickly this was taking place? The critics, the early critics here at the time, they would have loved to have jumped on a story or on an account of at least one of these disciples recanting. No, you never mind. No, I don't believe it anymore. This is too much for me. This persecution, this threatening, being thrown in jail every other week of my life, I'm done with it. Early critics would have jumped on a story like that, if a story like that even existed. I read this quote. It says, early critics of the Christian church would have been eager to cite a tradition that an apostle had recanted his faith, if such a tradition existed. The silence of such in history is revealing. You never have any stories that in any of the persecution that they faced, that they recanted, that they changed their mind. This is just too much for me. They go from hiding to suffering persecution, and in the face of that persecution, staying strong, standing boldly for that. Ancient history also, I think this is letter D. Yeah, ancient history provides enough evidence to believe that at least 4 of the apostles were martyred. Not just threatened, not just beat, not just thrown into prison, but 4 of them ended up dying for their belief in the resurrection. Peter, Paul, Saul, who became Paul, James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the half-brother of Jesus. My. From not believing in his own brother to dying for his belief in the resurrection. It's a major transformation right there. People, just following this line of evidence here about these disciples or these apostles that were threatened and even died, people do not die for what they know to be a lie. If they concocted any of this, if they were making any of this up, there's no way they would have gone to the death standing by it. If I made something up, if I witnessed, I don't know, who should I pick on? It's got to be Brother Cam. If I witnessed Brother Cam robbing a bank, right, and it was told to the authorities that I was in the general vicinity and I was probably an eyewitness, and being a friend of Brother Cam, if asked by the authorities, did you witness it? Maybe I lie. I hope I wouldn't. Maybe I would lie and be like, no, I didn't see anything, right? Maybe a few days later, I'm questioned on it again in a more, intense interrogation type style, and I again stick by my story that this is my friend. I didn't see anything happen. If a gun is put to my head and said, listen, somebody said they saw you watch this, okay? We confiscated your phone and you took a video of it, right? And they put a gun to my head, I'm not dying for a lie. Does that make sense? Okay? The fact that these guys were willing to go all the way to the death, defending their belief that Jesus resurrected, speaks a lot. The apostles were willing to suffer and die for their belief in the resurrection, with at least 4 of them being martyred. Therefore, the testimony of the apostles is very likely reliable. But you not only have the transformation of the disciples, you also have the transformation of the critics. And we've referenced this a couple of times, so I'm going to move through it quickly. But James, the half-brother of Jesus, goes from not believing in him to history records the fact that James became the bishop of the Jerusalem church, an important figure in the Jewish Christian community. There's evidence to believe that James was martyred for his faith. What changed? He saw the resurrected Jesus. That's the only explanation for that kind of a 180-degree turn. Same thing with Saul, the persecutor of the church. He becomes Paul. How does he become one of the apostles and one of the greatest missionaries and defenders of the faith ever? He encountered the resurrected Jesus. So we've seen the empty tomb. We've seen the eyewitness accounts. We've seen the transformation of the disciples. And last of these 4 lines of evidence to support the resurrection is the spread of Christianity. Now, I didn't give you any subpoints on your worksheet for this one, the spread of Christianity, because I'm really just going to kind of take an overall thought and try to just put it all together. I didn't really have bullet points for this. But the Jews had and follow me here, okay? I'm going somewhere with this. The Jews had no concept of a Messiah who would be put to death as a criminal. This is not what they viewed the Messiah as being. They viewed the Messiah as someone who would come in and be a triumphant leader, maybe even a political revolutionary to overthrow the Roman government, right? This is what they viewed the Messiah as. They did not view the Messiah as someone who would fail to bring deliverance from Rome or refuse to reign, someone who would be humiliated, defeated, and killed by his enemies. This was all in contradiction from what they expected, right? This is probably why they were hiding after his crucifixion, because now their heads are spinning. What just happened? We thought he was the Messiah. He's going to overthrow Rome. He's going to be our leader. He's going to sit on the throne. Now he's dead? Now he's gone? What do we do? What did we just do for the last 3.5 years of our lives? So it can't be overstated that the crucifixion was an absolute disaster for their faith. To them, Jesus' death on the cross would have marked a devastating end to their hopes that he was the Messiah. But the belief that he resurrected reversed the catastrophe of the cross, and they viewed Jesus as the Messiah after all. They go from being crushed and defeated. This is not who we thought our Messiah would be. And now that he is resurrected, they encounter him, they see him, they meet with him, they even touch him after his resurrection. They begin to boldly proclaim the resurrection within weeks in hostile territory. Because of their preaching and the fact that critics could not produce evidence that Jesus was not resurrected, Christianity began to spread throughout the Roman Empire. Right? So they go from dejected, defeated, demoralized. There's the alliteration for you, Carmen. They went from dejected, defeated, demoralized, and now they're boldly preaching Jesus. Now they're, as we just talked about, they're going through persecution and trials and standing strong in it. And because of that, and because there's no shred of evidence that could come out and stand against them, Christianity begins to spread throughout the Roman Empire. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, that we just looked at so that we could see those eyewitness accounts, is also seen as one of the earliest known Christian creeds, like a motto or a mantra of the church. Ancient historians and Bible scholars alike date this oral tradition, almost like and I don't know if this is quite a fair analogy or comparison here, but almost like we would do a Pledge of Allegiance, right? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God. Almost like this kind of a creed or mantra. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, 3 through 8 also is one of these early Christian creeds. It's dated back to about AD 30 to 35, which is just a few years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So this would have been something that maybe the early churches would have quoted, would have memorized and said together. And this creed begins to circulate within a couple of years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Okay? This is lending, and we'll see it in a minute, this is lending credence to everything. Author Robbie Lashua, I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly, has this to say on the 1 Corinthians Creed. Historians are convinced that 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 is an early Christian creed that Paul is reminding the Corinthians of. Can we pull up I think it's verse 3. Can we pull that up? Yeah. He says that he received it. For I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received. So he's saying, this is something that someone handed down to me, and I'm making sure that I pass it down to you. Okay, so this is not Paul coming up with something. This is Paul saying, this was already in place. This was told and taught to me, and now I'm passing it down to you. He says he received it. It has the clear rhythm and cadence of a creed. You know, like when we do the Pledge of Allegiance, it's kind of rhythmic, right? It's easy to quote. And as you, maybe not for us because it's English, but maybe in the Hebrew language or in what they would have spoken, it had a very rhythmic cadence to it. There are phrases and words in it that are absent or rare in the rest of Paul's writings. This creed isn't something Paul invented. It existed prior to his writing 1 Corinthians and even prior to his 18-month visit to Corinth. This creed, which presents the gospel as the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus, shows that this understanding of the gospel goes back to the very beginning of the church. So the spread of Christianity, the origin of Christianity, hinges on the fact that he not only died and was buried, but that he rose again, and there is evidence to support the fact that he resurrected. Does that all make sense? Hopefully I was clear enough on that. So your 4 lines of evidence that we looked at is the tomb was empty, and there's no shred of evidence to the otherwise. Jesus appeared to groups of people at multiple times in multiple locations over a 40-day period of time, unexplainable by anything other than it actually happened, okay? The transformation of both the disciples and the critics. How do they go from scared to bold? How do they go from persecuting the church to planting churches, right? And then we have the spread of Christianity and the growth of the church throughout the Roman Empire, throughout a hostile territory. If I can give you this little acrostic to help you remember those 4. Now, there's a little bit out of order from the way we covered them. I give you this acrostic to help you remember those 4. It's the word test, T-E-S-T. The first T stands for the tomb, the empty tomb. The E stands for eyewitnesses. The S, the spread of Christianity. And then the second T, the transformation. So to help remember those 4, if you remember the word test, you have the tomb that was empty, the eyewitnesses to his resurrection, those that saw him. You have the spread of Christianity. You have the transformation of both the disciples and the critics. And help us remember those 4 lines of evidence that, again, are so to one side, right? If you're weighing the scales of the evidence for versus the evidence against, they tip the scales so drastically in favor of the resurrection being an actual event that took place. One last skeptical theory, and we'll finish right on time here, is, as we mentioned before, there's the skeptical theory that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. Okay? The disciples stole the body of Jesus. This theory, okay, where are we at here? Letter E, the disciples stole the body of Jesus. This theory would require a scared group of disciples who fled at Jesus' arrest. They're hiding in the room for fear of the Jews. They're not present at Jesus' crucifixion. It's going to take this group of scared disciples and have them turn on a dime and all of a sudden become bold enough to go take on the Roman guards at the tomb. Okay? We just saw a minute ago that they did turn on a dime and all of a sudden have boldness, but it wasn't out of the blue. There was a reason for that boldness. The fact that they saw Jesus resurrected, that changed things for them. If they're hiding in an upper room because they fled and they're scared, they're not going to all of a sudden be like, guys, you know what we should do? We should go steal the body, take on the Roman guards, move the 2-ton stone, leave his grave clothes folded up there, by the way, and go hide his body somewhere else. That'll show him. It's unbelievable to even take place, but that's what this story would require, okay? Bold enough to take on, historians vary on this, but anywhere from 4 to 16 highly trained elite Roman guards, or be lucky enough to catch all of the guards sleeping, okay? Which there's a couple problems with that as well, with the Roman guards sleeping. Letter A at the top of the last sheet of it, the penalty for these soldiers being caught sleeping was a capital punishment, was death. These guys were elite, highly trained, disciplined soldiers. Some have even said maybe rising to the same discipline level of Navy SEALs. This is what they trained to do. This is who they were. This is their livelihood. And to be sleeping on the job and not come through on what they were supposed to do, for them was a capital crime. They could have been put to death if they were caught sleeping. But that's not the only problem, okay? If all of them were sleeping and the disciples got by them and stole the body, if all the guys were sleeping, number one, how do they know who stole the body? Do you know anybody, if you're asleep, if you fall asleep here right now, and when you wake up, your phone is gone, do you know who took it? You know what I'm saying? How do you know when you're asleep? On top of that, these are just almost comical but logical thoughts here. If the disciples caught them sleeping and then begun to move a 2-ton stone, would they not make any noise at all and wake somebody up? And if one guard woke up, don't you think he wakes up the rest of them? There's so many holes to this theory that either they became bold enough to take on the Roman guards or somehow caught them sleeping and didn't wake them up. There's so many problems to it, right? If the disciples stole Jesus' body, they would not have fabricated the story about the women being the first to discover the empty tomb. Right, so even if, we continue on down this line that disciples stole the body, outside of how weird it would be for them to take on the Roman guards, right? If they did, why would they then turn around and make up the story that the women were the first one there to see the empty tomb? We keep hitting on that point, but it's such an important aspect to all of the story here. Number 4, why would the disciples have been willing to suffer persecution and death if they had stolen the body and lied about the resurrection? We've already talked about it. People are not willing to die for a lie. If they stole the body, however impossible it would be for them to get inside that tomb, if they stole the body, why would they go through such lengths and even die for it and not eventually be like, somebody down the line would have been like, I don't want to be the one to die. I'll show you where the body is if you give me amnesty, right? Just don't punish me. Let me live my life. Give me a new identity. I watch too many movies. And I'll go live somewhere else, all right? Somebody would have given it up by the end, but they didn't. And another major issue, and this will be the last one we hit here, again, right on time. Another major issue with the theory is the understanding of the word resurrection in the Jewish culture, okay? In the Jewish culture, the resurrection, letter A, their concept or their understanding of resurrection was not an event that took place in history and in which only one individual was raised. Within the Jewish culture, when they talked about the resurrection, it was an end of the world event, an end of the age event, in which all of the believing dead were raised. They had no concept of there being this resurrection in which only one person before the end of history could be resurrected within time. Does that make sense? Their understanding of resurrection was centered on the end, when we are all resurrected. So to them, if Jesus had died, okay, I missed this point. Letter C, consider the disciples' confusion in Mark 9 through 11 to prove this point, okay? In Mark 9 through 11, Jesus is telling them that he's going to rise again on the third day. Hold up, let me read it. Let me give you the exact thing here. Verse 9, Mark 9 says, and as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. Okay? So he tells them, Son of Man's going to rise again. Verse 10, and they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising of the dead should mean. They were confused about it. What does he mean when he rises from the dead? And they asked him, saying, why say the scribes that Elias must first come? They go straight to at the end of the age, Elijah's going to come first before we're all resurrected. Their understanding of the resurrection was an end of the world event, when we're all resurrected. Not that one person would resurrect from the dead within history, okay? So if the disciples stole the body, they wouldn't have even had this concept or this understanding of making up this story that one person rose from the dead, because that's not what they understood the resurrection to mean. Do we follow that? Does that make sense? Okay. I put this quote on there for you, again, from William Lane Craig's On Guard book. He says, thus, given the Jewish conception of the resurrection, the disciples, after Jesus' crucifixion, would not have come up with the idea that he had been already raised. They would have only looked forward to the resurrection at the last day, and perhaps, in keeping with Jewish tradition, preserved his tomb as a shrine where his bones could rest until the resurrection. So their concept of resurrection would not have permitted them to steal the body and then begin to falsify the story that he had rose again, because they didn't even understand that. They probably would have actually enshrined his tomb. This would have been a place just as we would go and visit the gravesite of a loved one and put flowers there. They would have enshrined this tomb as a great religious leader. And to them, we'll see him again one day when we all are resurrected from the dead. They would have not concocted this story on their own. So letter F. After careful examination of all the evidence, it is reasonable to conclude that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. As he said, that he physically, literally, legitimately rose from the dead. Of course, that he is alive today on the right hand of the Father. And our faith has grounding, has reasonable basis to be true because Jesus did, in fact, rise from the dead. Okay, I'm sure Brother Cam could have done a much better job than me, but I'm thankful he was allowed me to finish up my material here. Looking forward to the next couple weeks as we finish up. If you have any questions or anything, ask him. All right. Hope you have a good rest of your evening.
If you'd like more information about our church, visit our website at lbcdurham.org.